While empires argued, the princess found safety in a human. The queen understood too late. The Kareth diplomatic station had been in operation for 61 standard years, and in that time it had hosted 47 formal summits, produced 9 binding treaties, and quietly buried the evidence of 3 very nearly catastrophic misunderstandings between species who shared a solar neighborhood but little else. The station itself was a compromise made of steel and pressurized atmosphere, neither the orbital ring favored by the Veil 3 Dominion nor the subterranean complex the Karathi Collective preferred, but a midpoint suspended between both preferences and therefore satisfying to neither. That was, more or less, the definition of diplomacy. Ambassador Lyra Solen had read the station's full operational history on the 8-day transit from Karathi Prime. She had read it twice in fact, once for content and once for what was absent from the record. The absences were more instructive. No mention of the 2284 dispute over the Venn corridor's navigational rights, which had resolved not through the summit convened for that purpose but through a quiet side conversation between a Karathi water trade minister and a Veil 3 logistics officer over a shared meal. No mention of the 2301 interpreter error that had very nearly caused the 3rd Dominion fleet to mobilize before a junior Veil 3 aide had quietly corrected the transcript. Small people making small corrections that held the galaxy together. The ambassadors got the credit. The historians recorded the treaties. The architecture of peace was built by people whose names appeared in no index. She was not one of those small people. She was the full Karathi ambassador, 3rd daughter of the reigning matriarch, carrying in her blood and her title all the weight the collective could project into this room. She was also, by any honest accounting, exhausted. The summit's nominal purpose was the outer reach demarcation, a centuries-old boundary dispute that had flared again when both the Dominion and the collective had independently sent survey vessels into the Vethra belt, and those vessels had exchanged what the official logs called navigational warnings, and what the censor records, if one read them carefully, described as weapons locks. A third party, the Yenari Free Settlements, a loose confederation of mining colonies with no standing army and considerable anxiety about being caught between 2 empires, had filed a formal complaint with the Interstellar Arbitration Bureau, which had no enforcement power but significant influence over trade licensing. The result was this summit, required, reluctant, and already 3 days behind schedule because the Veil 3 delegation had objected to the humidity settings in the main conference chamber. The Veil 3 delegation was led by High Arbiter Suvath Karath, a being of considerable age and, according to every briefing Lyra had received, essentially immovable opinion. He had negotiated the Palindri Accords 40 years ago and had not updated his approach since. His support staff consisted of 12 specialists in various legal and technical disciplines and one person who appeared to have no formal role. A human, notably, who sat at the far end of the delegation's table during plenary sessions and occasionally passed notes to the High Arbiter through an aide. Lyra had noted him on the first day and then, given everything else demanding her attention, filed him away in the category of curiosities to return to. Princess Sarah Veilthren, 3rd daughter of the Dominion's ruling triad, observer status, no formal speaking role, noticed the human on the first day too, but for entirely different reasons. She had been sent to observe and to learn, which in the diplomatic vocabulary of the Veil 3 Dominion meant she was being kept close enough to be controlled and far enough from consequence to be sacrificed if the summit produced a scapegoat. She was 18 years old in Veil 3 years, which translated to roughly 24 in human terms, and she had been being kept close and kept far simultaneously for most of her life. The human's name, according to the station staff manifest, was Corporal Davin Rice, attached to the Terran Diplomatic Security Corps. His job, as far as anyone had formally described it, was to ensure the physical safety of the human technical advisors embedded with the Veil 3 delegation. In practice, Sarah had observed, he mostly sat near exits, drank terrible coffee from a metal thermos, and watched rooms the way people watch rooms when they have learned that trouble rarely announces itself. He looked like someone who had long ago stopped being surprised by anything and had arrived instead at a state of patient, alert readiness, not suspicious exactly, but present in a way most people in that room were not. On the 3rd day of the summit, the Veil 3 delegation's water supply was found to be contaminated with a cleaning compound that the station's maintenance AI had incorrectly routed through the wrong intake valve. It was not sabotage, the investigation confirmed this within hours, but in the 6 minutes between discovery and confirmation, the High Arbiter's security detail had locked down the Veil 3 quarters, the Karathi delegation had been formally notified of a possible hostile act, and 17 people had begun making calls to people with warships. Sarah had been in the corridor outside the conference room when it happened. She had watched the controlled panic unfold, The raised voices behind closed doors, the aides moving too fast, the security personnel doing the things security personnel do when they think a situation may be about to require them, and she had found herself standing very still in a corridor that was rapidly emptying, thinking that she did not know what to do and that no one had ever taught her, specifically, what to do when the room she was supposed to follow orders in had abruptly stopped issuing them. Corporal Rice had appeared at the end of the corridor, moving without hurry, and had assessed the situation in the particular way he assessed all situations, quickly and without visible alarm, and then he had walked to where Sarah was standing and said, with a directness that she would later come to understand was simply how he communicated, "You should not be in this corridor right now. If this escalates, you become a variable. Come with me and I'll get you somewhere with a door that locks." She had gone with him. Later she would spend considerable time examining that decision, the speed of it, the lack of hesitation, and she would conclude that it had not been trust, exactly. It had been something simpler. He had been the only person in that corridor who had looked at her and seen a problem worth solving, rather than a variable worth managing. The water contamination was resolved. The summit resumed. The 17 people with warships stood their calls down, one by one. The outer reach demarcation remained exactly as unresolved as it had been before. But somewhere in the station's less trafficked maintenance corridors, in a small utility room with a door that locked, a Veil 3 princess and a human security corporal had sat across from each other on equipment crates and waited for the corridor to become safe again, and had talked, because there was nothing else to do and because, as Davin would later explain it, simply, it seemed rude not to. Kareth Summit concluded on its 14th day with a document that ran to 11 pages, used the phrase, provisional navigational understanding 4 times, contained no binding commitments, and was described by both delegations' press liaisons as a significant step forward. The Karathi delegation returned to their vessels satisfied that they had conceded nothing. The Veil 3 delegation returned to theirs satisfied with precisely the same. The Yenari free settlements, who had initiated the complaint and whose asteroid miners would continue working in the disputed belt regardless of what any document said, were not formally informed of the summit's conclusion for another 6 days, which was standard practice and also somewhat encapsulating of the larger problem. Davin Rice filed his final security report at 2300 station time on day 14, packed his kit bag in the manner of someone who has packed and unpacked the same bag in different locations for many years, and then sat on the edge of his bunk in the security corps quarters and looked at the folded piece of paper in his hand. He had not been expecting correspondence. He was not, professionally or personally, someone who received a great deal of it. The note was handwritten in standard, which was either a deliberate choice or a practical one. Veil 3 script would have been meaningless to him and the princess had presumably known that. The handwriting was careful in the way of someone who had been taught precision but was not entirely comfortable with the language's particular letter forms. It said, "You explain the coffee. You did not have to. Most people do not explain things to me because they assume I already know them or that I do not require them. I wanted to say that I noticed." SV. He remembered the conversation. She had asked about the thermos, a genuine question, not social ritual, and he had explained that standard-issue diplomatic corps rations included coffee packets rated for reconstitution in any potable liquid, that the thermos maintained temperature for 18 hours, and that the coffee was genuinely terrible but that 18 hours of terrible was better than no hours of adequate. She had listened with the focus of someone cataloging information they intended to use, and then she had said, "Why do you drink it if it is terrible?" He had considered this and then said, "Because the alternative is nothing and nothing doesn't keep you alert." She had been quiet for a moment and then said, "That is a very human way to approach a problem." He had said, "Probably yeah." He put the note in the front pocket of his kit bag, which was where he kept things he intended to think about later. Princess Sarah Veilthren returned to the Veil 3 homeworld of Kael'thas aboard the diplomatic carrier Sovereign Thread, in the cabin assigned to junior observational delegates, which was adjacent to the vessel's atmospheric processing units and therefore somewhat louder than the rest of the ship. She had been assigned this cabin by the High Arbiter's staff coordinator, and she had long ago learned not to read intent into slights that might simply be logistical indifference. She wrote the note to Davin Rice 3 times before she was satisfied with it. The first version was too long. She had written nearly a page before recognizing that length without specificity was a form of noise. The second was too formal. The Veil 3 diplomatic register sat in her hands like a borrowed tool, shaped for other purposes. The third version said what she meant in the minimum words required, which she had noticed was approximately how Davin Rice communicated and which she had found, in retrospect, to be the most honest mode of speech she had encountered in 14 days of summit proceedings. She did not expect a reply. She had not given him a means of replying. She had given him the note because it was true and she had wanted it to be said. Whether it constituted the beginning of something had not, at the time of writing, occurred to her as a question. It occurred to her mother almost immediately. Matriarch Vailthran II, called Savara by those close enough to use the name, which was very few people, had informational networks aboard every vessel that carried members of the royal line. This was not secrecy, exactly, it was simply how the Dominion managed the complexity of a ruling family dispersed across multiple systems. Savara received a summary of her daughter's activities during the summit within 30 hours of the carrier's departure from Kareth Station, and she read it with the attention she gave all information, steadily without visible reaction, making notes in the margin of her own internal accounting. The note to the human security officer was flagged by her information coordinator as a social anomaly, departure from expected behavior, possible risk vector for external influence, recommend monitoring. Savara had marked the flag as received and returned to the summary. Sarah had attended all required sessions. She had made no unauthorized communications. She had, at one point during an apparent security incident, been escorted to a secured location by a member of the Terran Diplomatic Security Corps, which was within that corps' operational mandate. The note was a social grace extended to someone who had performed a service. It was unusual. Sarah was not, by history or by training, given to social grace, but it was not alarming. She made a note to watch and returned her attention to the larger matter of the Outer Reach demarcation, which remained unresolved and which 3 of her advisors were now suggesting might require military demonstration to resolve. 6 weeks after the summit, Davin Rice received a reassignment. Standard rotation. The Diplomatic Security Corps moved personnel through postings on 18-month cycles to prevent the kind of local familiarity that became either liability or leverage. His new posting was the Terran Consulate on Yenari Prime, the central administrative hub of the free settlements. He would be part of a 6-person detail assigned to the consul's residence, which was a posted position rather than a traveling one, which was unusual for him and which his commanding officer described as a recognition of his skills and which Davin understood, from context, to mean he had been reliable enough to be trusted with something boring. He accepted the posting, packed his kit bag and boarded his transit vessel. In the front pocket of the kit bag, behind the coffee packets and the folded station map he always kept out of habit, was the note from the princess. He had not thrown it away because it was the kind of thing that felt wrong to throw away, and because in his experience, which was considerable though not in ways that appeared on any official resume, things that felt wrong to throw away usually mattered eventually, even if you couldn't yet see why. He was 3 hours out of Kareth Station when he found, tucked inside the station map in a way that suggested deliberate placement, a second piece of paper. It was a communication frequency, a diplomatic relay channel, the kind embedded reporters and off-record correspondents used, the kind that moved through 4 routing nodes and left no clean origin trace. There was no name attached to it. There was no explanation. There were only the frequency codes and, beneath them, in the same careful handwriting, in case you have something to explain. Davin looked at the paper for a long time. Then he put it in the front pocket of his kit bag, next to the first note, and looked out the transit vessel's small porthole at the stars sliding past, and thought about the particular way she had listened when he explained things, not like someone waiting for a pause in the noise, but like someone building something from the words, assembling them into a structure she intended to use. He had met many kinds of people in the service of the Terran Diplomatic Corps. He had not previously met anyone who listened like that. Inari Prime was a cold planet, geologically young and atmospherically thin at the altitudes where the colonial infrastructure had been built, and the Terran consulate sat on a ridge above the mining district's administration quarter in a building that had been designed for a warmer climate and had never been adequately retrofitted. The heating worked adequately in the main offices and the consul's residence. In the security details quarters, it worked intermittently. Davin had purchased a second thermal underlayer within his first week and considered the matter resolved. He had been at the posting for 3 months when Princess Sarah Vailthran arrived on Yenari Prime as part of a Veil 3 trade delegation. A junior inclusion, her role described in the official visit manifest as cultural observer, which Davin recognized as diplomatic language for someone the lead delegation wanted present but not speaking. The Veil 3 were negotiating resource extraction agreements with the free settlements, which had the advantage of sitting between both major empires and the disadvantage of knowing it. The Terran consulate was not formally party to the negotiations but was, as always, watching carefully and making itself available as a neutral party in the event that either side needed an excuse to pause. He had not expected to see her. He had communicated with her 6 times over the preceding 3 months through the relay frequency she'd left him, Brief exchanges, factual in character, about things she had encountered or questions she had formed. She had asked him once about human conflict resolution. Specifically, why human diplomatic history suggested that trade relationships consistently outlasted political agreements. He had thought about it for 2 days before responding because he wanted to answer correctly rather than quickly, and had eventually written, "Political agreements are between governments which change. Trade is between people who need things regardless of who their government is. The need is more durable than the structure." She had replied within an hour, "That is the most useful thing anyone has said to me in 3 months." He saw her in the consulate's public reception hall on the second day of the trade delegation's visit. She was with the Vale 3 trade minister's staff, standing near the window that overlooked the ridge, and she was looking out at the cold landscape with the expression of someone who finds practical geography more interesting than social performance. He recognized the expression because it was one he associated with people who were only partly in the room they appeared to be in. She saw him in the same moment and her expression changed, not to warmth, exactly, which was not a register she seemed to operate in naturally, but to something more specific. Recognition as a kind of relief. They did not speak at the reception. That would have required explanation, and explanation would have required attention, and attention from the wrong sources would have created problems for both of them. But afterward, in the consulate's secondary corridor that connected the reception hall to the administrative wing, they walked past each other in the way people walk past each other in narrow corridors, and he said, quietly and without slowing, "Commissary 2200. Coffee is still bad." She did not reply and did not need to. The consulate commissary at 2200 was empty except for the automated beverage station and the cleaning unit making slow passes across the floor in the far corner. Davin was there first, which was his habit in all situations. He had 2 cups of coffee. The commissary version was marginally better than the thermos version, and was reading the Yenari mining report on his datapad when she arrived. She was wearing civilian clothes rather than the delegation's formal wear, which meant she had changed specifically for the visit, which meant she had planned it, which told him things he filed away without comment. She sat across from him without preamble and looked at the coffee cup and then at him. He said, "The commissary version uses actual beans rather than reconstituted powder. It's still not good, but it's better in the way that understanding a problem is better than not understanding it, even when the problem remains." She almost smiled. He had learned to recognize the Vale 3 equivalent, a slight shift in the orientation of the secondary eyelids, a marginal relaxation of the jaw musculature. "You explain things," she said. "Everyone else translates. There is a difference." "What's the difference?" "Translating gives you the words in your language. Explaining gives you the shape of the thought." She picked up the coffee cup, examined it, and drank. Her expression did not change. "It is still not good." "No," he agreed. "But now you know why." They talked for 2 hours. This was, in retrospect, the session that mattered, not the summit's utility room where the conversation had been provisional and situation-driven, but this one, which was chosen and therefore meant something different. She told him about the trade delegation's actual purpose, which the official manifest had not accurately described. The Vale 3 were not seeking resource agreements so much as they were seeking to prevent the Karathi from securing them, and the distinction mattered enormously to anyone who lived in the Yenari system and wanted to continue doing so without choosing a patron empire. He told her about the Terran consulate's actual position on the negotiations, which his commanding officer had not told him but which he had worked out from the pattern of which meetings the consul attended and which one she sent her deputy to. They were, he would later reflect, talking past their official roles and describing the actual situation to each other, which was something that rarely happened at any level of the diplomatic apparatus and which was either the beginning of genuine trust or the most elaborate mutual manipulation either of them had ever attempted. He had assessed this question during the walk back to his quarters and concluded that he did not think she was manipulating him. Not because she lacked the capability, she was clearly intelligent and trained in political navigation, but because manipulation required a goal, and he could not identify what she would have gained from telling him the actual strategic calculus behind the Vale 3 delegation's presence. She had offered him information that, if used, would benefit Yenari and Terran interests at the expense of her own delegation. That was not manipulation. That was something else. He found in the morning that she had left his jacket, a standard Terran core thermal jacket he had lent her at some point during the evening, when the commissary's heating had cycled down, a gesture so automatic he had not registered making it, folded on the commissary table. On top of it was a note. "For words you would be cold." It was the first time in a long time that someone had thought about what he would need rather than what he could provide. The Vale 3 succession structure was old older than the Dominion itself, which had been formed from the consolidation of 4 competing dynastic systems roughly 3 centuries ago. The triad system, in which 3 co-equal ruling bodies checked each other's authority, was textbook political science as of Davin's last formal education, which had been a long time ago. What the textbooks did not adequately convey was the lived experience of being the third daughter of one of the triad's 3 members, the particular geometry of it, the way a position that sounded significant translated in practice into something more like perpetual suspension. Sarah had explained it to him over several conversations, not as complaint. She was not, he noticed, someone who complained easily or often, but as description. There were 3 daughters and 1 son in matriarch Savara's line. The son, Kalin, was heir designated. The eldest daughter, Mareth, was trained for the diplomatic corps in a senior capacity and would likely hold an ambassadorial position of genuine authority within the decade. The second daughter, Yusult, was being positioned for the Dominion's scientific administration. And Sarah, the youngest daughter, was, what exactly? Flexible, was the word Savara had apparently used in a family council, which Sarah had not been present for but had been informed of by Mareth, who informed her of things their mother said in the approximate way one passes on weather reports. Useful information neutrally delivered, requiring you to make your own decisions about what to carry. Flexible meant available. It meant she could be sent to summits in observer capacity, to trade delegations as cultural attaché, to academic conferences as the Dominion's representative interest in interspecies relations. A portfolio that sounded meaningful and was, in practice, whatever the situation required someone dispensable to do. She was not being punished. She was not being ignored. She was being held in reserve, which, when you were the one being held, had a very particular quality to it that did not appear in any official description of the role. Davin had listened to this without interrupting, which was his general approach to information he considered important. When she finished, he had said, "How long has that been the plan?" She had said, "I don't think it has ever been a plan exactly. I think I am an open question." He had thought about this and said, "Open questions are uncomfortable to live as, but they're the only form with the capacity to become something unexpected." She had looked at him, the particular assessing look she gave information she was deciding whether to trust, and said, "That is a very optimistic construction of an uncomfortable situation." He had said, "I'm not an optimist. I'm a person who reads historical patterns. Systems that are designed for flexibility almost always end up using that flexibility in ways their designers didn't predict." She had been quiet for a moment. "You are saying I might matter in a way that hasn't been assigned yet." He had said, "I'm saying you might matter in a way that can't be assigned. Those are different categories." The Yenari trade negotiations concluded after 11 days with a framework agreement that was, structurally, almost identical to the Kareth Summit's provisional navigational understanding, binding in aspiration, vague in detail, satisfying to no one and therefore acceptable to everyone. The Veil 3 delegation departed. Sarah sent him a message through the relay frequency 2 days after her departure. The minister called it a success. "I believe he means we did not make anything worse. Is that sufficient? Is that what this work amounts to?" He thought about the answer for 4 days, which was longer than usual. Eventually he wrote, "I've been in the Corps for 11 years. In that time I've been present for one thing that I would call genuinely good, by which I mean it made people's lives concretely better in a way they could feel. Everything else was exactly what you described, not making things worse. For a long time I found this depressing. I stopped finding it depressing. Here's why: the alternative to not making things worse is making things worse. There are people in the Yenari belt right now whose mining operations will continue because 2 empires chose, again, to keep arguing instead of acting. They don't know that. They'll never know it. But they're still there." She replied, "I have been trying to understand why you are in the diplomatic security corps specifically. You think too carefully for a role that is primarily about being present and alert. There are other roles for careful thinkers." He replied, "I had a different role. It required me to make decisions faster than careful thinking allows. The outcomes were sometimes correct and sometimes not. I preferred a role where being careful is the whole job, even if the job is mostly standing near doors." There was a pause of 6 days before she replied, which was unusual. When she did, it was brief. "I understand that. More than I expected to." He did not ask what she meant. He thought he knew, and he thought asking would be a form of pressure, and pressure was something he tried not to apply to things that were still forming. The situation changed 8 weeks later, when the Karathi Collective launched a survey expedition into the Vethra Belt. 12 vessels, accompanied by a formal declaration that they were exercising navigational rights established under the Provisional Understanding from the Kareth Summit, which the Vale 3 Dominion immediately and loudly disputed on the grounds that no such rights had been established, only the possibility of future negotiation regarding such rights, and that there was a material difference between these two things. The Yenari Free Settlements, whose asteroid mining operations were in the belt, filed emergency status with the Arbitration Bureau and began quietly asking the Terran Consulate whether their defensive agreements with humanity's diplomatic guarantors were still operative. Davin read the situation reports in his quarters at 0600 and understood, with the calm that came from long familiarity with accelerating situations, that the next phase would not be resolved by the careful machinery of formal diplomacy. That machinery was already 3 sessions behind reality. The summit had kicked the problem forward. The problem had arrived. He sent a message through the relay frequency. Said only, "Are you safe?" Her reply came in 40 minutes, which was fast even by the relay's routing. "For now. The triad is convening. I have not been invited. I believe, being flexible again. Are you?" He looked at the situation reports on his datapad. He looked at the relay frequency comm code he had memorized months ago. He thought about open questions and unexpected categories and the particular shape of a thought rather than the words for it. He wrote, "I'm going to do something that may or may not be sanctioned by my chain of command. If it works, it will be described as initiative. If it doesn't, it will be described as insubordination. I need to know one thing first. Do you trust me?" Her reply took 11 minutes. "Yes. I worked out why 3 months ago. I've been waiting for a situation that required me to say so." He plan, if it could be called that, which Davin would have disputed, preferring the word approach for something with this many unresolved variables, required 3 things. First, physical access to a secure communication node that wasn't being monitored by either the Karathi or Vale 3 intelligence apparatus, both of which were currently extremely active. Second, a channel to the Yenari Free Settlements Executive Council that bypassed the formal diplomatic protocols, which were currently so clogged with official communications from both empires that actual information was moving slower than the situation. Third, a way to get the princess off the Vale 3 carrier that was currently serving as the Dominion's mobile diplomatic headquarters in the system, which was on high alert and was therefore the worst possible environment for a third daughter who had been designated flexible to be present in. The first problem was solvable. Yenari Prime had an old communications relay infrastructure, pre-colonial, built by the original survey teams, that nobody had maintained or monitored in 40 years because its bandwidth was too low for modern data loads. For a text-based message transmission, which was all they needed, it was perfectly adequate and essentially invisible to surveillance systems calibrated for contemporary signal profiles. Davin knew about it because he had read every infrastructure report for the posting in his first week, which was something he did everywhere he was assigned, because the thing that would save you was usually something you'd read in the third document on a list of 12. The second problem was also solvable, though it required a conversation with the Terran consul that he was not entirely certain would go the way he hoped. He requested the meeting, described it as a security assessment update, and sat in her office at 1400 and explained his actual thinking, which was that the Yenari Executive Council needed to hear, from someone with no official stake in the outcome, that the current situation was more manageable than both major empires were currently representing, and that the key to management was doing nothing dramatic for approximately 72 hours while backchannel pressure was applied at 3 specific points he had identified. The consul, a woman named Ajua Mensa who had been in the diplomatic service for 30 years and had a particular expression she used when hearing plans that were simultaneously good and inadvisable, had listened without interrupting and then said, "You want to use the old relay infrastructure?" He had said, "Yes." She had said, "Which means this conversation isn't in any log." He had said, "No." She had looked at her desk for a moment and then said, "If this fails, you were acting independently and I had no knowledge of it." He had said, "That's accurate regardless of what you do next." She had said, "All right. The Yenari Council contact is Minister Arev Olin. He'll be in his office until 1800. Don't use the consulate's equipment." He had said, "I know." She had said, "Of course you do. Go." The third problem was harder because it was not logistical but political. Specifically, the question of what it meant for a Vale 3 princess to voluntarily relocate from the Dominion's carrier to the Terran consulate during an active diplomatic crisis, and whether relocating was even the right word for something that would look from certain angles like defection or asylum, and from other angles like exactly what it was. A person choosing to be somewhere they could think rather than somewhere they were managed. He raised this with her directly through the relay. He explained the options as he saw them, including the risks of each. He did not frame it as a rescue. He was explicitly careful about this, because rescue implied helplessness and she was not helpless. She was constrained, which was different. He explained what she could provide from the consulate that she could not provide from the carrier: independent communication, access to the backchannel process, and the specific value of being a Vale 3 royal who had visibly chosen a neutral ground, which sent a signal to the Yenari Council that the Dominion was not monolithic in its current posture. She had replied, "You are describing a political maneuver that also happens to move me out of an environment I find increasingly untenable. You are being careful to frame it as the former." He had written, "Yes." She had written, "Why?" He had thought about this carefully because it mattered to get right. He had written, "Because the political value is real and you should decide based on that. If I told you I was offering you an exit from a difficult situation, you would be deciding based on personal relief, which is a less durable basis for a decision than strategic logic. The political value doesn't disappear if the personal relief is also true." A pause of 20 minutes. "Then, you understand that by thinking about how I make decisions, you are also doing something that is not purely strategic." He had looked at this for a while. He had written, "Yes." She had arrived at the Terran consulate 16 hours later, via a medical transport that had been diverted by, officially, an environmental systems concern on the carrier that required non-essential personnel to disembark temporarily. The carrier's medical officer had filed the paperwork. Davin had noted, without asking, that the medical officer was a human, one of the technical secondments that were common in Vale 3 diplomatic vessels. He had not asked how Sarah had arranged it. He suspected the arrangement had involved her saying exactly what was needed to exactly the right person, which was the thing she was, he had come to understand, genuinely excellent at, not manipulation but precision. She knew what was true and she said it in the order that mattered. She walked into the consulate's secondary entrance at 0340, carrying a single bag and wearing civilian clothes, and he was there because he had been there for 2 hours, because being early was something he did when things mattered and could not be undone. She looked at him and said, "You are always already present." He said, "It's a habit." She said, "It is a kindness that presents itself as a habit." He did not argue with this because he was not certain it was wrong. He showed her to the room that had been prepared. She looked at the window, a real window looking out over the ridge, the mining district lights below making the cold landscape navigable and almost warm. She said, "This has a window." He said, "Yes." She said, "My cabin on the carrier does not." He said, "I know. The manifest was in the infrastructure files." She turned and looked at him with the expression that was the Vale 3 equivalent of something he did not have a clean word for, not gratitude exactly, which felt too transactional. Something that acknowledged, specifically, being seen. He went back to his post. She went to the window. Outside, the mining district worked through the night, because or did not care about empire disputes, and the people who needed to eat did not either. Atriarch Savara received the notification of her youngest daughter's relocation to the Terran consulate at 0610 Kael'thas prime time, which was 7 minutes before her intelligence coordinator would have delivered it, because she had developed, over a long career, a sensitivity to the particular silence that preceded significant information, a quality of the room changing before the content arrived, as though the weight of the thing caused a displacement in the atmosphere around it. She read the notification twice. She set it on the surface of her work desk, which was made of a dark material that absorbed light rather than reflecting it, as she had always preferred surfaces that did not insist on themselves. She looked at the notification for a moment longer. Then she called her chief of staff. "My daughter is at the Terran consulate on Yenari Prime." The chief of staff confirmed this. "She is there of her own decision." The chief of staff confirmed this also. The medical officer who filed the transport paperwork. Pause. "Is he still on the carrier?" Another pause. "He has been there for 12 years. Savara did not respond immediately to this. She said, "Who authorized his secondment originally?" The answer came, the previous Vale 3 diplomatic fleet commander, who had retired 8 years ago. So no one currently in the apparatus made a conscious decision to have him there. He is simply, there. The chief of staff confirmed this. Savara looked at the dark surface of her desk. Interesting. She did not, at this stage, order Sarah's return. She had reasons for this that she did not explain to her chief of staff and would not explain to the intelligence coordinator when he arrived 7 minutes later with the notification she had already read. She had been, for 31 years, the ruling matriarch of a system that contained multitudes, And in that time she had learned to recognize when pulling on a thread would unravel something useful and when it would simply demonstrate that you had pulled. She did not yet know which this was. She would watch. The backchannel work took 4 days. David and Sarah worked from the consulate's old relay infrastructure. Him coordinating with Minister Olin and the Yenari Executive Council, her drafting the framing documents that would allow the Veil 3 Dominion to de-escalate without appearing to have done so under pressure. This last part was delicate in a way that required someone who understood, specifically, the internal political grammar of the Dominion's ruling apparatus, the particular forms that allowed face to be preserved while course was altered. And Sarah had this understanding in the way of someone who had spent a lifetime in rooms where that grammar was spoken and who had paid attention even when no one expected her to. David watched her work. He had worked with many people in his 11 years of service and he had a practitioner's eye for the difference between performance and function. She was purely functional. She did not draft the framing documents in ways that made her appear intelligent. She drafted them in ways that solved the specific problem, which in this case was giving the Veil 3 Triad a path to call the survey expedition an exercise of navigational consultation rights pending final arbitration, rather than a retreat, which was what it was. The language was surgical. The solution was invisible. That was, he understood, the highest form of the work, to make the correction so seamlessly that the need for correction was never acknowledged. "Your mother is watching," he said on the 3rd day. It was not a question. "She is always watching," Sarah said, not looking up from the document she was annotating. "That is not surveillance. That is governance. There is a difference in intent, though I acknowledge the experience is similar." Pause. "She has not recalled me." Another pause, shorter. "That is significant. What does it mean?" She set down the annotation stylus. She looked at the window, the mining district, the cold ridge, the lights. "It means she is watching to see what I do, not watching to stop me from doing it." A silence. "She has never done that before. She has always been watching to manage outcomes. This is different." She looked at him. "You did something when you sent for me. You gave her something to observe that she had not expected." "I gave her you operating without constraint," he said, which apparently she hadn't seen. "No," Sarah said. She hadn't. "I hadn't been given the room." She picked up the stylus again. "I'm not angry with her. I want to be clear about that. She is a very effective matriarch. Her calculus has been generally correct. I am simply a variable she had not fully accounted for." Pause. "I suspect she is revising her models." The Karathi survey expedition received a formal communication on day 4, jointly issued by the Yenari Executive Council and, notably, a private communication from the Veil 3 Triad's office, not the official diplomatic channel but the discretionary channel used for intra-aristocratic correspondence, the kind that acknowledged a message was being heard rather than formally processed. The content of that private communication was not shared with the Karathi delegation in detail, but its existence was, and its existence communicated, in the language both empires understood, that the Veil 3 Dominion was paying attention in a mode that preceded formal response, which was the mode that preceded actual consequences. The Karathi survey expedition did not withdraw. It did, however, cease its active scanning of the belt's occupied sectors and move to a holding position that was technically within the claimed navigational corridor but practically indistinguishable from waiting, which was what they needed to do. 72 hours, David had told the Yenari Council. Do nothing dramatic for 72 hours. They had managed 89. On the evening of the 4th day, Consul Mensa called David to her office and looked at him for a long moment and said, "The Yenari Executive Council has sent a formal commendation to the Terran diplomatic mission. They have been diplomatically vague about who specifically they are commending, which is the correct instinct." She looked at her desk. "The Veil 3 Triad's office has sent a communication acknowledging the consulate's support extended to Dominion personnel during a medical transit. That is also the correct instinct." She looked at him. "The Karathi ambassador has filed a formal query about the princess's presence at this consulate." David said, "I expect so." Mensa said, "I have replied that the Terran consulate provides standard accommodations to diplomatic personnel of all species in the event of medical or logistical necessity, which is true and not informative." David said, "Thank you." She looked at him again with the expression he recognized, the good and inadvisable expression. "The princess," she said. "She drafted the de-escalation framework." It was not a question. He said, "Yes." The consul was quiet for a moment. "She's very good." He said, "Yes." She said, "Does her mother know that?" Pause. He said, "I think she may be finding out." Later that night, a message arrived at the consulate's official diplomatic intake, formal on Veil 3 Triad letterhead, addressed to the Terran consul, requesting courtesy notification regarding Princess Sarah Veilthren's schedule and well-being. Standard language. Appropriate distance. But it was signed by the matriarch personally, not her office. Savara had held the pen herself. That was not standard language. That was not appropriate distance. That was a matriarch paying attention in a different mode than she had deployed before. Davin read the notification in the morning and thought, there it is. The thing that happens when a system encounters a variable it hasn't accounted for. Not collapse. Adjustment. The system bending toward the thing it had failed to see, trying to incorporate it before the gap became structural. He hoped it was not too late for the bending to matter. He thought, from what he knew of Savara, that she was the kind of person who bent quickly once she decided to. The question was what she would do with what she found when she looked clearly. Atriarch Savara arrived on Yenari Prime without announcement, which was, for a head of state traveling in her official capacity, essentially impossible, and therefore communicated, immediately and clearly, that she was not traveling in her official capacity. She came on a diplomatic courier vessel, 6 personnel including her personal security, no press attachment, no advance team, no formal notification to the Veil 3 Dominion's public affairs apparatus. The only notification she had given was to the Terran consulate 48 hours in advance, via the consulate's private diplomatic intake, requesting a meeting with the consul and, the line that Davin read 3 times, personnel associated with recent navigational mediation efforts at their convenience. At their convenience. Savara of the Veil 3 Triad, who had ruled a multi-system empire for 31 years and who had been addressed as Your Sovereignty, since before Davin Rice was born, was requesting a meeting at the convenience of a corps corporal and her own youngest daughter. Davin went to Sarah with the notification. She read it twice. She was quiet for a moment that was longer than her usual pauses, which were already longer than most people's. Then she said, she wants to see what I actually am. He said, yes. She said, she could have called me back. She didn't. He said, no. She looked at the window, the mining district, the ridge, the cold clear air of Yenari Prime that tasted different from Kael'thas air and that he had noticed, stopped commenting on, which was the sign that she had begun to simply live in it rather than observe it. She is coming here, Sarah said, because she cannot understand what happened here from a distance. She needs the room. Pause. I grew up watching her need the room. She always found a way to enter it on her own terms. Another pause. She is finding a new way. He said, are you ready to see her? She looked at him, the assessing look, the one that built things from what it found. You are asking whether I am prepared for the personal experience, not the political meeting. He said, yes. She was quiet. I don't know, she said. I have not been in the same room with my mother since before the Kareth summit. I am, a different arrangement of the same elements. He said, so is she probably. She looked at him. How would you know that? He said, because she's coming here. People who are the same as they were don't travel to where the evidence is. They wait for the evidence to be translated for them. The meeting was in the consulate's main conference room, which had been cleared of its standard diplomatic fixtures and arranged in the informal mode, a table without a designated head, chairs rather than fixed seats, the kind of room that encouraged everyone present to choose their own position rather than accepting the assigned one. This had been Consul Mensa's suggestion, and Davin had agreed with it, and Sarah had added only that the window should be uncovered, which it was. Savara entered without ceremony. She was taller than Davin had expected. Photographs and official images scaled everything toward the symbolic, and the actual person was larger and also somehow less formidable, which was the paradox of meeting people who had previously existed only as representations. She looked around the room with the attention of someone cataloging details, and when her eyes found Sarah they stayed there for a moment that contained, Davin observed, something that was visible even across species physiognomy, the particular quality of a person encountering a fact that had been true for a long time but had not yet been confronted. Sarah stood. She did not bow, which in Veil 3 protocol was the greeting between equals rather than between a matriarch and her subject. Savara, after a moment, inclined her head, the acknowledgement that the greeting had been received and accepted in the form it was offered. It was a very small moment. It contained an enormous amount of information. They sat. Consul Mensa opened with a formal welcome and then, very professionally, said almost nothing for the next 40 minutes, which was the correct instinct in which Davin, from his position near the door, noted with appreciation. The conversation was between Savara and Sarah primarily, with Davin contributing when directly addressed. Twice specifically, once when Savara asked him to describe the backchannel process, which he did in precise and unembellished terms, and once when she asked him why he had decided to act rather than escalate through his official chain of command. He said, "Because my chain of command would have taken 72 hours to process the request and reach authorization, and the situation had approximately 48 hours before it required a decision. The correct action and the authorized action were not available simultaneously. I chose the correct one and accepted that the authorization would come retroactively or not at all." Savara had looked at him for a moment. She said, "And if it had not come retroactively?" He said, "Then I would have faced the consequences of having done the right thing, which is a better position than the consequences of having done the authorized thing and watching it fail." She had looked at him for a long moment. "You are," she said, "a very unusual type." He said, "I've been told that." She looked at Sarah. She said in Veil 3, Davin's translator rendered it a beat delayed, the slight lag that reminded him he was always working across the gap of language even when he forgot it. "You chose well." Sarah said in Standard, which was either a deliberate signal or simply the language she now thought in first, "I had good information." Savara's jaw musculature did the thing that Davin had come to recognize as the Veil 3 equivalent of a smile. "You always had good information," she said. "I did not always give you sufficient room to apply it." Pause. The kind of pause that in any language means something is being put down that was heavy. "I am correcting my models." The formal outcomes of Savara's visit were minor and procedural: a renewed commitment to the Kareth Provisional Framework, a request from the Veil 3 Triad's office to the Arbitration Bureau for an accelerated arbitration schedule on the Vethra Belt, and a quiet acknowledgement between Consul Mensa and Savara's staff that the backchannel relay infrastructure on Yenari Prime had proven useful and might benefit from, if not formal recognition, then at least informal maintenance. Nothing about these outcomes would appear in the diplomatic histories as significant. The Korathi survey expedition withdrew from the holding position 2 weeks later when the arbitration schedule was confirmed, which was recorded as a Korathi diplomatic concession and attributed to pressure from the Bureau. The Yenari mining operations continued. On Sarah's last night at the Terran consulate, before her return to Kael'thas in her mother's courier vessel, she and Davin sat in the commissary at 2200. The coffee was the same as it had always been. The cleaning unit made its slow passes in the far corner. She said, "She is going to offer me a new assignment. Something with actual authority." I can see her thinking about it. He said, "Is that what you want?" She said, "I want to do the work. The title is incidental." He said, "The title is what gives you access to the rooms." She said, "Yes. I know. I have spent my life in rooms I was allowed into because of the title, doing work that was invisible to the people who control the title." I think she is beginning to see that the arrangement was inefficient. He said, "Inefficient is one word for it." She said, "I know other words. I chose that one because she will respond to efficiency arguments before she responds to other kinds." He looked at her. He said, "You're already thinking about how to make the conversation work." She said, "I am always thinking about how to make the conversation work. That is what you do when the conversation matters." She picked up her coffee cup and then set it back down. "You are going to receive a transfer request," she said. "From my mother's office. A secondment to the Veil 3 diplomatic security apparatus. It is going to be described as an interspecies exchange program." He said, "Is it actually that?" She said, "It is that, and also an acknowledgement that you are someone she wants inside the apparatus rather than outside it, which is the highest compliment she knows how to pay." Pause. "You don't have to accept." He said, "I know." She said, "But you will." He said, "Probably." She said, "Why?" He said, "Same reason I always do anything. The alternative is nothing, and nothing doesn't keep you alert." She almost smiled, the secondary eyelids, the jaw, the whole architecture of it. He had learned to read it across a year of conversations in utility rooms and commissaries and cold-windowed offices, and it was each time the same, not the performance of warmth but the actual thing, expressed in the only register she trusted, which was precise and quiet and entirely her own. She said, "You explained that to me once. About the coffee." He said, "I remember." She said, "You didn't know then that you were explaining something larger." He said, "I knew. I just didn't know whether it was relevant yet." She was quiet. Outside, the mining district worked through another cold Yenari night, ordinary and essential and paying no attention whatsoever to the diplomatic machinery that had, again, chosen argument over action and been saved, again by the small corrections of people whose names appeared in no official record. Matriarch Savara had understood in the end. Not too late, but later than she should have, and she knew it, which was the particular discomfort of a matriarch who was also honest enough to count her costs accurately. The outer reach remained disputed. The empires remained suspicious of each other. The universe remained vast and indifferent and full of problems that required, more than anything else, people willing to sit in the same room and explain things to each other until the shape of the thought arrived. Humans were, in this regard, not uniquely gifted. They were simply unusually practiced. They had been explaining things to each other, badly and then better and then badly again for as long as they had been anything at all. They had learned, through the accumulated weight of every mistake that was survivable, that the conversation, however poor the coffee, was worth continuing. Davin Rice refilled his cup. Sarah Vailthren picked hers back up. Outside, the lights of the mining district mapped the cold ground below, and somewhere in the Vethra belt 12 survey vessels and the miners whose livelihoods orbited the same dark rock continued their parallel existence, unaware that the latest iteration of their survival had been negotiated in a commissary at 2200 by a human who stood near doors and a princess who listened until she understood the shape of things. It was not, by any diplomatic standard, a significant event. It was the kind of event that held everything else together, invisible and load-bearing, which is precisely the kind of event that matters most.